I had told myself I wouldn't make a scene. Not at my son's wedding. Not when the chandeliers above sparkled like falling stars and the air smelled of roses shipped in from halfway around the world. I kept my head down, hands folded on my lap, trying to make myself small in a room built for people who thought themselves larger than life. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. I sat at a corner table of the grand ballroom, the kind of place I would have once reserved for clients, when my name still carried weight. Back then I wore tailored suits and spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he had built something lasting. Tonight, my suit came from a second-hand store. The cuffs were frayed, the shoes worn thin, though I'd polished them until they shone. I was determined to at least arrive with dignity, even if I was treated as little more than a shadow in my own son's life. The orchestra played softly as servers glided across the floor, pouring champagne into tall glasses. Guests whispered about venture capital, vacation homes, and stocks climbing higher. I couldn't ignore how their eyes lingered on me, some with curiosity, others with pity. But pity wasn't what cut the deepest. It was the silence from Daniel, my own flesh and blood, who looked across the room and quickly glanced away as though acknowledging me would stain his perfect tuxedo. Victoria Price made her entrance like royalty. Her gown shimmered with beads and silk, worth more than every car I had ever owned combined. She moved with deliberate grace, each step a reminder of her status. Her father, Richard Price, walked proudly beside her, a man whose empire had been built on acquisitions that crushed smaller innovators like me. Few here knew that my downfall had his fingerprints all over it. He wore the smile of a conqueror, while I remained the conquered. When the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, I hoped I could remain unnoticed. I focused on the plain chicken breast on my plate, chewed slowly, and convinced myself that perhaps surviving the evening quietly would be enough. Maybe Daniel could move forward with his new life, and I could slip out before midnight without drawing attention. But fate and Victoria's hunger for spectacle had other plans. It started during the maid of honor's speech. Emily Carter, a woman with carefully styled hair and a voice meant to carry, spoke of perseverance, of triumph over hardship. She looked directly at me as she spoke, weaving lines about how not everyone overcomes, but some remain stuck in their misfortunes. I felt hundreds of eyes shift in my direction, the weight of judgment pressing down on me harder than the suit's shoulders. Then Victoria rose from her seat, her crystal glass raised high. She smiled, not the smile of a bride glowing with joy, but the smirk of a victor ready to deliver a finishing blow. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called, her voice clear and deliberate, "allow me to introduce you to my new father-in-law." The ballroom fell silent. 300 faces turned. Phones rose discreetly, recording, eager for drama in the middle of an expensive celebration. I swallowed, set my fork down, and slowly stood as she motioned toward me. "This," Victoria continued, "is Luke Harrison. Once upon a time, he liked to call himself an innovator, even a business leader. But look where life has carried him. A man who spends his nights in shelters, a man who couldn't keep his own family afloat. And now, he sits among us, not as a success, but as a reminder that failure is contagious if we're not careful." A ripple of laughter spread across the tables. I felt the blood rise in my ears, but forced myself not to flinch. Years on the street had taught me the power of silence, how stillness could cut deeper than any shouted defense. She leaned closer, her voice sharpening, for the cameras she knew were rolling. "Some people are simply born incapable. My husband may feel pity, but I will not allow pity to disguise weakness. Mr. Harrison represents everything my family has taught me to avoid: fragility, poor choices, and disgrace." I scanned the crowd, searching for Daniel's eyes. My son stood frozen, lips pressed tightly together, gaze fixed on the floor. Not a word, not a single defense for the man who had raised him. I steadied myself, feeling the weight of every mocking glance, every cruel whisper. Victoria thought she had broken me. She thought this was my final defeat. But as I looked across the room, my eyes met Richard Price's. I gave him the faintest nod, subtle enough that most missed it. He returned a confused half-smile, unaware that the nod was not respect. It was a warning. Inside, I was no longer the beaten man in a Salvation Army suit. I was cataloging every insult, every witness, every recording. While they laughed, I calculated. While they sipped champagne, I remembered every detail of what had been taken from me. When I finally spoke, my voice carried low, steady, almost gentle. Congratulations on your daughter's wedding, Mr. Price. I'm sure you must be proud of the woman you raised. Gasps rippled across the room at my audacity. Then I set down my glass, straightened my jacket, and walked slowly toward the exit. Cameras followed, and so did silence. The silence of people realizing they had just witnessed the start of something they did not yet understand. Victoria believed she had erased me from Daniel's life. Richard believed he was untouchable in his glass tower of wealth. Daniel believed his father had been defeated. But I knew the truth. This night was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. People often imagine that ruin comes like an earthquake, sudden, violent, leaving you with no time to prepare. For me, it came like a slow leak in the foundation of a home. Day by day, dollar by dollar, I watched everything I had built seep into the ground until there was nothing left to hold the structure upright. There was a time when people used to return my calls within minutes, back when Harrison Innovations was still a name whispered with respect in boardrooms across the Midwest. We were a lean team, just over 50 employees, but together we had created technology that promised to change how portable devices processed information. Our patents weren't just ideas sketched on napkins. They were working prototypes, proof that imagination could be engineered into reality. I used to walk into our offices each morning with Margaret's kiss still fresh on my cheek, proud that I was building something we could one day hand down to Daniel. But life, I would learn, does not bargain with pride. Margaret's cough started small. We thought it was nothing. Allergies, maybe a stubborn cold. By the time doctors uncovered the truth, the cancer had already taken root deep inside her lungs. What followed was a blur of hospital corridors, whispered consultations, and bills stacked higher than the monitors that beeped above her bed. I sold our home first, the house where Daniel had grown tall enough to carve his height into the kitchen doorway, where Margaret had planted roses along the fence. Then I sold the cars, the furniture, and finally, with shaking hands, my stake in the very company I had founded. Distressed asset acquisition, Richard Price's lawyers called it, as though dressing theft in legal clothing made it less cruel. They came to me while I was still planning the funeral, their contracts polished and their smiles sharper than knives. My life's work, my patents, my algorithms, gone for pennies while my hands still trembled with grief. I thought I had reached bottom when Margaret passed, but rock bottom has a way of shifting beneath your feet. Friends who once toasted my successes vanished. Investors who had promised loyalty rewrote history and painted me as reckless, careless with money, too emotional to survive in business. Within months, I was no longer Luke Harrison, visionary. I was just another man whose ideas had been swallowed by a bigger shark. Daniel visited at first. He was in college then, trying to balance his studies with the weight of his mother's absence and my unraveling. He brought meals sometimes, sat across from me in bare apartments as I searched classifieds for work that would never come. But pity grows heavy in young hands. With each visit, I could see the discomfort building behind his eyes, the need to escape the sight of a father who once stood tall, now bent under invisible weight. When the eviction notices came, I tried to hide them from him. I told him I was downsizing, or between places, but lies have a short shelf life. One evening he stood in the doorway as I packed the last of my clothes into a trash bag, and the silence between us was louder than any accusation. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. That was the night I began measuring my life, not in contracts signed, but in shelter beds found. The Riverside Mission became my address, a cot pressed against the wall, thin sheets, and the company of men whose stories were as fractured as mine. Some numbed themselves with bottles, others with silence. I chose a different refuge, the glow of public library screens. While others spent their days waiting in line for soup or a cigarette, I sat among dusty stacks of books, fingers flying across keyboards that didn't belong to me, building pieces of a future no one could see. Still, the shame was relentless. It trailed me when I walked the streets, when acquaintances crossed to the other side rather than meet my eyes. And worst of all, it followed me into Daniel's visits. He brought Victoria once or twice, back before she was his wife. I remember her eyes sweeping over the shelter walls, the curled lip she tried to disguise with polite words. "It's unfortunate," she said softly, as though my condition were a temporary illness instead of a collapse. Daniel said nothing, only pressed his lips together as if silence could erase the awkwardness. I should have expected that he would one day see me less as a father and more as a burden. Still, watching that shift happen, watching him tuck parts of me away as though ashamed of my reflection in his life, carved wounds deeper than poverty ever could. By the time the wedding invitations were sent, I knew my presence wasn't requested for love or respect. It was demanded as a prop, a living exhibit of what Victoria's family wanted Daniel to forget he came from. People think falling is sudden, but the truth is, falling is gradual. It's the small compromises, the documents signed in grief, the dignity surrendered one painful inch at a time. And when you've fallen far enough, you stop noticing the ground rushing toward you. You just brace for the impact and hope you can still breathe when it comes. That was my life before the wedding, a man stripped of titles, of wealth, of love. But what none of them understood, not Daniel, not Victoria, not Richard Price, was that I had not been idle in my ruin. While they counted me among the forgotten, I was quietly preparing. And the day would come when the same hands that signed away my company would tremble before me. When the invitation first arrived, I almost didn't open it. The envelope looked too fine, the kind of stationery chosen not to invite someone warmly, but to remind them of what they no longer belonged to. I ran my thumb along the edge, staring at my name written in script so elegant it felt like mockery. Mr. Luke Harrison scrawled across the front, as if dressing me in formalities could disguise the truth of where I slept at night. Daniel hadn't been the one to deliver it. That should have told me everything. Instead, it came through the mail, folded alongside a glossy card showing a picture of the venue, a mansion-sized hotel ballroom with marble floors and gilded ceilings, the kind of place where a man like me had no business standing unless I was carrying a tray. I debated throwing it away. In truth, I think Daniel hadn't wanted me there. But Victoria, she wanted me front and center. Not as family, not as father, but as evidence, a reminder of what Daniel had escaped by choosing her world. By the time the day came, I had convinced myself to attend for Daniel's sake, even if his fiancée's motives were cruel. I scoured the thrift store for a suit that didn't sag too heavily at the shoulders. I polished old shoes until my fingers ached, trying to hide the holes at the toes. Standing before the cracked mirror in the shelter, I told myself appearances might buy me enough dignity to last a night. The hotel glittered like a palace when I arrived. Chandeliers caught the light and scattered it across polished marble in fractured patterns. Guests flowed through the lobby like a river of silk and satin, their laughter carrying the careless melody of people who had never once worried about rent or hospital bills. My presence alone was like a stone dropped into that stream. People noticed. They always do. Some glanced and quickly turned away, unwilling to let their gaze linger too long on the one who didn't belong. Victoria made her entrance with deliberate grandeur. Her gown shimmered with delicate beadwork, a dress designed not only to flatter, but to declare wealth like a banner. She floated across the aisle on her father's arm, chin lifted, every step polished by years of privilege. And though the ceremony words were gentle, vows of love, promises for the future, I caught the way her eyes cut toward me more than once, sharp and assessing, like a cat watching a cornered mouse. I sat near the back, content to keep to myself. I sipped water when others drank champagne, folded my hands when the music swelled. When the reception began, I found the smallest table and made myself invisible. Or so I thought. The maid of honor, Emily Carter, rose to give her speech. Her smile was wide, her tone light, but as she spoke of overcoming obstacles and choosing strength over weakness, her eyes darted toward me again and again. It was subtle, but deliberate. The audience noticed. Heads turned, whispers began, the hum of curiosity thickening in the air. Victoria waited until the moment was ripe. With a glass of champagne raised high, she glided toward my table. Her heels clicked against the polished floor like the countdown to a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice magnified by confidence and cruel anticipation, "I'd like you all to meet my new father-in-law." 300 heads swiveled in my direction. My throat tightened as I set down my fork. The room hushed, not with respect, but with expectation. Phones lifted discreetly, the audience primed for a performance they hadn't known they were waiting for. "This is Luke Harrison," Victoria continued, each syllable delivered with the precision of a dagger. "He once fancied himself an inventor, a businessman. But look where he sits now, a man dressed in cast-offs, a man whose home is not a house, but a shelter bed." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some pitying, others amused. I felt the sting not just in her words, but in the way Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the room, saying nothing, doing nothing. Victoria's voice sharpened. "Some people believe family is forever. I disagree. Family should uplift, not weigh you down. And my husband deserves better than to be tethered to this." She gestured toward me, her manicured hand slicing the air. For a moment, the humiliation was suffocating. The laughter, the whispers, the cameras capturing every second, it all pressed down on me. But beneath the weight of it, another thought bloomed. She hadn't invited me out of kindness. She had invited me as a warning, a living display meant to cement her victory. She wanted Daniel and her guests to see what failure looked like up close, and as cruel as it was, she had miscalculated. Because while she used me as a prop, I was quietly taking notes. Every insult, every witness, every recording, they were not the nails in my coffin. They were the stones with which I would build something far stronger. I didn't respond that night, not in the way she expected. I simply raised my glass in Richard Price's direction, offered him a thin smile, and allowed myself the smallest nod. He returned it absently, unaware of what it meant. He thought it was acknowledgment, but it was a promise, a quiet vow that one day the empire he had stolen from me would be the very ground he'd kneel upon. 2 mornings after the wedding, I woke to the sound of laughter that wasn't in the room. It came from the next cot over, where a man scrolled through his phone, earbuds dangling. He tapped the screen, then turned it toward me. "Hey, Harrison," he said, half amused, half sympathetic. "Ain't this you?" I stared at the video. My own face filled the small screen. Me in the thrift store suit, sitting stiffly in the ballroom's corner while Victoria's voice sliced through the air. The clip cut to guests snickering, phones rising, my son's frozen silence. It had been uploaded with a caption in bold letters. "Bride roasts, homeless father-in-law at 200K wedding." My stomach clenched. The video had already amassed hundreds of thousands of views. By noon, the count reached 1 million. By evening, it had trended on multiple platforms under hashtags I couldn't bear to read. Wedding fail, family trash, luxury V's loser. At first, I thought the cruelty might crush me, but as I scrolled through the comments on a library computer, a strange thing happened. The laughter wasn't universal. In fact, a tide of outrage was swelling. "Who humiliates their husband's father like this?" one person wrote. "This bride is pure evil," another added. Even strangers could see what Daniel had refused to acknowledge. Cruelty, dressed in pearls and lace, is still cruelty. But for every voice of compassion, another spat venom. Memes spread with my picture, captions calling me worthless, broken, garbage. Strangers debated my worth as though I were an object, not a man. The humiliation hadn't ended in that ballroom. It had been reborn on screens across the world. On the third morning, my phone rang. Few people still had my number, so I already knew who it might be. When I answered, her voice was as cold as it had been the night she stood over me with a champagne glass. "We need to talk, Luke." I set the phone against my ear and leaned back on the cot. "Good morning, Victoria. Married life treating you well?" "Cut the act," she snapped. "You know exactly why I'm calling. The videos, the comments. People are painting me as some kind of monster, all because you sat there pretending to be noble while I told the truth." I let her words hang, said nothing. The silence always made her stumble. Daniel's co-workers saw it. His boss asked if there were family issues. "Do you realize what you've done? You've embarrassed him. You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed this family." I almost laughed. Embarrassed them? She had invited me only to parade me as evidence, and now she choked on the smoke of her own fire. "I didn't film the video," I said softly. "Your guests did. You gave them the performance." Her breath hissed through the line. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to disappear from Daniel's life. No more visits, no more calls, no more pretending you're family. If you try, I'll make sure you regret it." "And if I don't?" She laughed then. Sharp, cruel. The laugh of someone who has always gotten her way. "Then I'll make sure no shelter takes you in. One call and you'll be sleeping under bridges. I'll have you declared mentally unfit. A restraining order will make it a crime for you to be within 500 feet of Daniel. My father knows the right people. Judges, council members, the police chief. Do you want to test me, Luke?" Her threats rolled off like water against stone. For 3 years I had endured colder nights, harsher words, sharper losses, and through it all I had been preparing. She tried to soften her tone, dripping false sweetness. "But I'm not unreasonable. If you disappear quietly, I'll make sure you get $1,000 a month. Cash. Enough for a small room. You'll never see Daniel again, but at least you won't freeze. Blood money. The price of silence." I could almost hear her smile through the line, convinced she'd cornered me. "What does Daniel think of this offer?" I asked. Silence stretched, then broke brittle. "He agrees with me. He's tired of making excuses for you. He wants a clean life, without your shadow hanging over him." The words stung, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. She hadn't asked Daniel. She didn't dare. "You have 24 hours to decide," she finished. "Disappear, or live a nightmare." I closed my eyes, breathing slowly, picturing Margaret's face, the warmth of her hand when life still felt steady. "I understand perfectly, Victoria." "Good," she replied, sharp with triumph. "There's just one thing you should understand, too," I said quietly. "Assumptions are dangerous, and you've made the wrong one." Before she could reply, I ended the call. For 3 years I had allowed the world to think I was finished, to see only the man in the shelter cot, the failure in worn shoes. That illusion had protected me while I worked in silence. Now Victoria Price had threatened the only bond I still valued, my son, and in doing so, she had lit the match that would burn her own world down. I pushed back the chair in the library's computer room, logged into an account she didn't know existed, and stared at the numbers waiting there. It wasn't much compared to what was coming, but it was enough to prove one thing. The game had never been hers to control. Most people assumed I spent those years wasting away, a broken man curled on a cot, counting coins and regretting choices. They saw the shabby clothes, the lined face, the way I walked with my shoulders bent against the cold, and they assumed that was all there was left of Luke Harrison. But there is a certain freedom in invisibility. When no one expects anything of you, you are free to work in silence. Every morning, after the shelter served its watery coffee and dry toast, I walked 6 blocks to the public library. The staff came to know me by sight, though they never asked questions. Perhaps they thought I was just another man seeking warmth, and in a way I was. But the warmth I sought wasn't only in the radiators. It was in the hum of computers lined up against the far wall, machines most patrons used to check email or browse the news. To me, those screens were lifelines. With headphones muffling the chatter of schoolchildren and job seekers, I buried myself in code. Old habits stirred my fingers like muscle memory, bringing back the same fire that once fueled all-night sessions at Harrison Innovations. Only this time, I wasn't building for shareholders or investors. I was building for survival and for revenge. The algorithms I developed were not born of luxury. They were born of hunger, of desperation sharpened into focus. I scribbled formulas in battered notebooks, their covers stained with rain from nights spent outside. I tested prototypes on used phones I bought with food stamp money, piecing together devices from pawnshop scraps. Each breakthrough was a spark, each line of code a reminder that my mind had not been taken from me, even if everything else had. But building was only half the battle. I needed to protect what I was creating. So with care, I opened hidden accounts, email addresses masked behind proxies, financial ledgers disguised in the names of shell companies. The world thought I had no presence online, yet in the digital corridors, where real deals are made, I became a ghost that no one could trace. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to drown me. I'd sit in the glow of the library screen, eyelids heavy, Margaret's memory pressing close. "Keep going," I'd whisper to myself. "If not for me, then for her, for Daniel." And somehow, strength always came. It wasn't long before whispers began to reach me. Investors sniffing around, companies desperate for the kind of innovation that had once put my name on magazine covers. I kept them at bay. I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not until the right partner appeared. That partner came in the form of Horizon Technologies. At first, it was just cautious emails, disguised introductions through intermediaries. I demanded encrypted channels, proxy accounts. They must have thought me paranoid, but they humored me because the technology I dangled was unlike anything they had seen. For 6 months, we negotiated in shadows. They asked for demonstrations, and I delivered them on burner devices mailed in unmarked boxes. They ran tests, returned with offers, and each time I pushed them higher. Finally, the figure they named was enough to still even my doubts. $300 million. For a man living in a shelter, that number might have sounded like fantasy. But for me, it wasn't about wealth alone. It was about legitimacy, validation, proof that the world had been wrong to bury me. Still, I kept the deal quiet. I wasn't ready to step into the light. Remaining invisible allowed me to work, to prepare, to watch Victoria and Richard Price strut across their empire, ignorant of the storm building beneath their feet. Victoria thought her threats would crush me, that I would cower at the thought of losing shelter space or tremble at the idea of being declared unstable. But what she couldn't see, what no one could see, was that every hour she spent sneering at me, I was writing the future she couldn't stop. I remember the exact moment I decided to move from shadow to flame. It wasn't the videos or the mocking hashtags. It was her voice on that phone call, dripping with triumph as she tried to erase me from my son's life. That was when I knew the time for silence had passed. The documents were already in order. The accounts were set. All that remained was a single call. One phone number saved under the name Horizon Chen. When I pressed it, everything would change. I closed my notebook one final time in the library that day, slid the battered pages into a plastic bag, and slipped it under my arm. As I stepped out into the brisk wind, the city looked different. The streets weren't alleys of defeat anymore. They were the stage for what was coming. I had been their prop, their shame, their scapegoat. But I was about to remind Richard Price and his daughter that nothing is more dangerous than a man underestimated. And the next time we met, it wouldn't be in a ballroom corner. It would be in a room where I controlled the lights. I stood outside the library that morning with my notebook tucked under my arm and the weight of a decision pressing on my chest. For years I had lived in the shadows, quietly building, quietly enduring, but shadows could only shelter me for so long. It was time to step into the light. The wind carried the scent of roasted coffee from a cafe across the street. Commuters brushed past in crisp suits, their polished shoes striking the pavement like a metronome. I blended into their blur, another man in a second-hand coat. No one would have guessed that inside the phone clutched in my hand, a single number waited that could change the direction of my life. I found a quiet bench in the park near the fountain where pigeons strutted and children tossed crumbs. My fingers hesitated over the keypad. $300 million? Even saying the number in my mind felt surreal. For years I had counted spare change, rationed meals, stretched every donated blanket. And now I was about to reclaim more than money. I was about to reclaim myself. I pressed dial. Luke Harrison, a steady voice answered. We've been expecting your call. It was Mark Reynolds, Horizon Technologies Acquisitions Executive. He had been my point of contact for months, professional to the point of being almost clinical, yet there was a note of respect in his tone now. I've reviewed the latest documents, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I'm ready to finalize. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. Our board is unanimous. Horizon will acquire your algorithms in full. $300 million, wired to your designated accounts, contingent on today's signatures. We'd like to announce immediately after. Immediately, the word hummed in my chest like a live wire. We confirmed details, intellectual property transfers, confidentiality clauses, the public statement. Horizon would tout this as a landmark acquisition, a discovery of brilliance long overlooked. I listened to the terms with the detachment of a lawyer, but beneath that mask, my pulse hammered. When I ended the call, I sat still on the bench, staring at the water arching into the fountain. For the first time in years, my shoulders lifted. The invisible weight that had bent me finally shifted. That afternoon, I checked into a small hotel with a bed that smelled of fresh linen instead of disinfectant. I shaved the gray stubble that had shadowed my jaw, bought a new suit that fit not perfectly but well enough, and looked into the mirror. The man staring back wasn't the wreck from the shelter. He wasn't the silent prop at the wedding. He was Luke Harrison, survivor, creator, and now, once again, a man of means. The next day, Horizon released the press statement. My name spread across headlines. Horizon Technologies acquires revolutionary algorithms from innovator Luke Harrison. The figure, 300 million, blazed beneath it. I imagined the scene at Price Tech when those headlines hit. Richard Price reading the name he had buried years ago, realizing the man he once crushed had risen higher than he could have anticipated. I pictured Victoria scrolling through her feeds, the same platform she once used to mock me now, lighting up with my resurgence. But the sweetest image was Daniel. My son sitting at his desk, surrounded by co-workers who had whispered about his homeless father. They would now see me not as an anchor, but as a man who had quietly rebuilt. Whether Daniel felt pride or shame, I couldn't guess. But he would no longer be able to ignore me. I booked a car that night, not a limousine or anything flashy, but a clean black sedan that rolled through the city with quiet dignity. My destination wasn't the library or the shelter, it was Price Tech's tower. As the lights of the skyscrapers glittered against the evening sky, I leaned back in the seat, running a hand over the smooth fabric of my new jacket. The chauffeur glanced at me in the mirror, but I offered nothing more than a small nod. My thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on the faces I would soon see again. Richard Price had believed me finished. Victoria had thought her humiliation permanent. Daniel had convinced himself I was too broken to rise. They were about to learn otherwise. The sedan slowed as we approached the towering glass building. My reflection stared back at me in its windows. A man returned from ruin, a man carrying not just wealth, but the weight of justice. Tomorrow I would walk into Price Tech, not as a prop, not as a beggar, but as a storm. The next morning I stood in the marble lobby of Price Tech, the air sharp with cologne and the faint hum of expensive shoes crossing polished floors. Men in tailored suits passed by, glancing at me with curiosity, but not recognition. I had been erased from this place years ago. Today I returned not as a ghost, but as a man reborn. Daniel was waiting in the atrium cafe, seated at a table tucked by the windows. He looked older than I remembered, the boyish softness gone, replaced by the hard lines of a man carrying expectations heavier than he understood. His tie was loosened, a coffee cup half empty in front of him. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes widened, then narrowed in disbelief. "Dad?" I smiled faintly, pulling the chair opposite him. "Daniel?" He blinked at the suit, the neat shave, the clean lines that had replaced years of wear. His confusion was almost painful to watch. You look different." "I should hope so," I said gently. "I couldn't very well keep showing up in thrift store coats forever, could I?" Silence stretched between us, filled only by the clinking of cups around the cafe. Finally, I leaned forward. "You didn't say anything. At the wedding. You let her do that to me, and you said nothing." Daniel's throat worked as he swallowed. "Dad, it was complicated. There were 300 people. There was one person," I cut in, "your wife. And she wasn't just mocking me. She was mocking you, your blood, your history." His jaw tightened. She was out of line, yes. But what was I supposed to do? Argue with her in front of everyone? Embarrass her? Start my marriage with a public fight? "You started your marriage by burying your father." My voice was low, steady. "That choice has consequences, Daniel." He looked away, eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the glass. For a moment, I saw the boy who used to follow me around the workshop, hands smudged with grease, asking questions about circuits and codes. That boy had wanted to be like me. This man wanted only to escape me. "I'm not here just to scold you," I said, softer now. I slid a folder across the table. He glanced down, hesitant before flipping it open. Inside were documents, patents with my name on them, bank statements, the press release announcing Horizon's acquisition. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. 300 million? I nodded. The algorithms they stole from me, improved and protected. Horizon saw their worth. The world will too. He shook his head slowly, disbelief warring with something else. Awe, maybe pride, though buried under layers of guilt. I thought you had nothing left." "That's what she wanted you to believe," I said. "What Richard Price wanted you to believe. But you should know better. You are my son." Daniel's hand lingered on the documents, his fingers tracing the bold numbers as if they might vanish. Then he looked up, eyes searching mine. "What does this mean for them?" I leaned back, letting the weight of my next words settle. "It means Price Tech is about to face a lawsuit that will shake its foundations. Patent infringement. Fraud. The kind of case that empties bank accounts and shatters reputations." His breath caught. "You're suing my father-in-law?" I'm holding him accountable, I corrected, for what he took from me, for what he did to your mother, for what his daughter tried to do to me in front of the world. Daniel looked torn, the conflict tearing across his face like a storm. Loyalty to his wife on one side, loyalty to blood on the other. For years he had chosen silence, chosen distance. Now silence was no longer an option. You don't have to choose sides tonight, I said quietly, but understand this. The man you saw humiliated at your wedding is not the man sitting before you now, and the family you've married into is not as untouchable as they pretend to be. I gathered the folder, leaving one page behind, the press release with my name in bold letters. I stood, straightened my jacket, and met his eyes one last time. You wanted a clean break from your past, but sometimes the past doesn't let go. Sometimes it knocks on the door of your future. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel Daniel's stare burning into the paper, into the truth he could no longer ignore. And I knew that the next time we faced each other, it would not be in a cafe, but in the storm I was about to unleash on his new family. Price Tech's tower loomed above me like a monument to arrogance, 50 stories of glass and steel stabbing into the sky. Years ago, I had stood on the ground floor of this very building as a man whose ideas were being stripped and sold. Back then I was grieving, desperate, too broken to fight. Today I came as something else entirely. The receptionist barely looked at me before pressing the phone to her ear. Within minutes, a suited aide appeared, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. "Mr. Harrison," he said cautiously, "Mr. Price will see you now." I followed him through a maze of hallways lined with portraits of past achievements. Headlines, product launches, awards all mounted like trophies. Each frame was a reminder of how much of my life's work had been cannibalized and repackaged under another man's name. At the end of the corridor, heavy double doors opened into Richard Price's office. The space was cavernous, walls of glass overlooking the city, shelves stacked with books more for display than use. Richard sat behind a wide mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit worth more than a year of shelter meals. He looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said smoothly, "if it isn't the ghost of Price Tech's past." I didn't return the smile. I walked forward, taking the chair opposite him without being asked. "Ghosts don't usually come with press releases." His eyes flickered, a brief crack in his polished mask. He had seen the headlines. He knew Horizon's deal had put my name back into circulation. Still, he leaned back in his chair, feigning amusement. "Congratulations on your little windfall, though I wonder how long it will last. Fortune has never been kind to you, Luke." I clasped my hands, letting silence stretch before I spoke. "I didn't come here to reminisce. I came to offer you a choice." That got his attention. His smirk faded into something more measured. "A choice?" "Horizon has acquired my algorithms. They're prepared to license the technology exclusively. But I suggested we give Price Tech the first look. Imagine, the same innovations you tried to bury, now within your grasp again. You could partner instead of steal this time." His jaw tightened ever so slightly. I had touched the nerve. "What's your price?" he asked carefully. "Not money," I said. "Acknowledgement. Legitimacy. A seat at the table where my work is used, not discarded." For the first time, Richard leaned forward, elbows on his desk, studying me like a chess opponent whose next move he couldn't predict. "And if I decline?" I smiled thinly. "Then Horizon enjoys the profits alone. And you, Richard, remain the man who built an empire on borrowed bones." I imagine the board won't enjoy seeing headlines about patent infringement, especially when those patents have my name attached. The word infringement landed between us like a stone in water, ripples spreading. He masked it quickly, shifting his papers, feigning calm, but I caught the twitch in his fingers. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted. His head of R&D, Dr. Alan Kim, stepped inside, holding a folder, his expression tight. "Mr. Price, may I have a word?" His eyes flickered toward me, then back to his boss. Richard waved impatiently. "Later, Alan. I'm in the middle of something." But Alan didn't move. He placed the folder firmly on the desk. "It can't wait. We've completed the internal review you requested. You need to see this." Richard shot him a glare, but opened the folder anyway. His eyes skimmed the pages, and the color drained from his face. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely. I waited silent, watching the storm gather behind his eyes. Alan cleared his throat. "Our systems, our latest products, are already running code that matches Mr. Harrison's patents, down to the variables. We thought we had cleaned the old architecture, but it appears we've been using his work all along." The room fell into heavy silence. I could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls, the ticking of Richard's luxury clock on the shelf. Finally, Richard closed the folder with a snap and looked up at me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "You think you've trapped me, Luke, but this company is larger than you can imagine. We'll weather this." I leaned forward, my voice low, measured. "You don't even realize it yet, Richard, but the storm is already inside your walls." For the first time, Richard Price didn't have a smile. If Richard Price's office was a fortress of glass, Victoria's battlefield was digital. She didn't need marble floors or boardrooms. All she needed was a phone in her hand and an audience hungry for spectacle. Within days of my meeting with her father, Victoria's voice filled the feeds again. I woke one morning to dozens of alerts on the hotel television. News anchors replayed clips of her speaking to a camera, flawless in makeup and lighting, her tone painted with the perfect balance of sorrow and indignation. "I tried," she said, eyes glistening as if tears lingered just out of sight. "I tried to welcome him into our family. But you can't reason with someone who refuses to help themselves. My husband has suffered for years because of his father's instability, and now, after everything, he's trying to exploit us, to ruin our happiness." Her words dripped with poison dressed as pity. In another video, she described me as unstable, a manipulator who spun stories of victimhood. She shared carefully cropped photos of the shelter where I had slept, captions twisted to suggest I preferred misery over work. The comments section erupted in fire. "She's right. Some people just drag others down. What a disgrace of a father." But there were others too, voices that cut through the noise. "This woman sounds rehearsed. Why is she still obsessed with humiliating him if he's so irrelevant?" Still, the volume of her attack was staggering. She gave interviews, appeared on podcasts, even staged charity events, where she positioned herself as an advocate for families dealing with unstable relatives. Every camera she faced was another knife aimed at me. Daniel stood beside her in many of these appearances, his smile strained, his silence louder than any words. I wondered if he even realized he was being used as a prop now, the same way I had been. Perhaps he did, and he lacked the strength to stop it. For a lesser man, her campaign might have worked. She had wealth, reach, and the confidence of someone who had never been told no. But what she failed to see was that every slanderous word, every false accusation was being documented. I hired a team of attorneys from the money Horizon had advanced me. They compiled her videos, her posts, her interviews, every shred of defamation neatly cataloged in digital folders. Each lie became another piece of ammunition, another thread in the noose she was weaving for herself. One night, I watched one of her interviews play on a late-night talk show. The host asked her why she continued to speak about me when most people would have chosen to ignore. She laughed, tossing her hair, and said, "Because cockroaches don't disappear just because you close the lights." I turned off the television and sat in silence for a long while. Not out of anger, but out of certainty. Her arrogance was uncontainable, and arrogance always writes its own downfall. The calls from my lawyers became more frequent. Every time she opens her mouth, she makes our case stronger, one said. It's only a matter of time before a judge sees this for what it is. Still, I knew public opinion mattered. I couldn't let her dominate the narrative forever. So I gave Horizon permission to move forward with their press tour. Journalists began to tell my story. Not the caricature she painted, but the truth of a man who had been robbed, endured loss, and still built something remarkable from nothing. Articles called me the innovator who refused to die. Others called me the man the system overlooked. And with each headline, Victoria's fury deepened. Her posts grew sharper, her tone shriller. She began leaking evidence, altered documents meant to smear my name. But every forgery was easily dismantled by my team, and each exposure made her look more desperate. One evening, as I left a meeting with my lawyers, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The words chilled me, even as they made me laugh. "You won't win, Luke. I'll burn you before you burn us." No signature, but I didn't need one. I knew her voice, even in written form. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, walking down the quiet street toward the waiting car. Above me, the skyscrapers glowed, their windows reflecting a city that never cared for the broken. But now I wasn't broken. I was patient. Victoria Price thought she was orchestrating my destruction. What she didn't realize was that she was standing center stage, performing the very play that would collapse her world, and I would be in the front row when the curtain fell. The air inside the boardroom felt thick, though the ceiling soared and the glass walls revealed the endless skyline. I could feel every set of eyes turning toward me as I stepped inside, briefcase in hand, lawyers trailing close behind. Price Tech's directors sat around the long, polished table, men and women in sharp suits, faces carved into practiced neutrality. But their silence spoke volumes. They had heard the headlines, seen the rumors, and now they wanted answers. At the head of the table, Richard Price sat stiff, his hands clasped tightly, a mask of calm stretched across his face. Beside him sat his daughter, Victoria, glowing with venomous confidence. She had insisted on being here, though the meeting had not been meant for her. Clearly, she thought this was another stage, another performance where she could tighten the noose she believed was around my neck. "Mr. Harrison," Richard said smoothly, as if we were old colleagues catching up. "You've asked to address the board. You have 10 minutes. I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it slowly, deliberately. 10 minutes will be enough. The first page I slid across the table bore my name in bold at the top. U.S. patent filings, freshly certified, notarized. The directors leaned forward, their eyes flicking to Richard, then back to the documents. "These," I said, "are my patents. Algorithms developed years ago, stolen under the guise of a distressed acquisition. Since then, they have been illegally incorporated into Price Tech's products. Horizon Technologies recognize their value. They've acquired them legally, and they're prepared to pursue any company that infringes." Richard's jaw tightened, though his smile never fully slipped. Bold claims from a man who's made many in the past. What proof do you have that our systems use your so-called innovations? I nodded toward my lawyer, who pressed a button on the projector. The screen lit up with side-by-side code comparisons. Horizon's engineers had dissected Price Tech's software, tracing entire strings of code back to my original algorithms. Line by line, the similarities were undeniable. A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Patricia Williams, one of the senior directors, leaned forward. "This is substantial. Richard, did you know about this overlap?" Richard forced a chuckle. "Coincidences happen in technology. Code looks similar across industries. This is smoke and mirrors." Before I could respond, Victoria slammed her palm on the table. "Why are we even entertaining this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This man is a fraud. He's mentally unstable, he's been living in shelters, and now he's trying to blackmail us with fabricated evidence. Do you know what he did at my wedding? He humiliated me in front of everyone. He's obsessed, deranged." The outburst startled some of the directors. I remained seated, calm, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. Then I pulled out another file. Screenshots, transcripts, videos. Every slanderous word she had uttered online, every twisted lie she had posted, catalogued neatly. This, I said quietly, is defamation. This is harassment. And this is admissible in court. Every word she's spoken against me strengthens my case. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's face flushed red, her confidence cracking under the weight of her own voice playing back from the speakers, her sneering laugh about cockroaches, her claims that I was unstable. Richard slammed his hand down, trying to reclaim control. Enough! This meeting is about business, not family drama. But it was too late. The board had seen enough to recognize the danger. Patricia's voice cut through the silence. Richard, if even half of this holds in court, the financial exposure could be catastrophic. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. I didn't come here to destroy Price Tech overnight. But understand this. Horizon owns my work now, and they will defend it. I will defend it. You can deny it here, but denial won't stop the truth from carving its way into daylight. The room felt heavier now. Directors exchanged glances. Whispers traveled from one end of the table to the other. Victoria seethed, her nails tapping furiously against the table, her composure shattered. Finally, one of the older directors spoke up, his tone grave. Mr. Price, I suggest we adjourn and review our options immediately. The meeting dissolved into a flurry of motion, directors gathering their papers, voices low with worry. I stood, collecting my files calmly. As I turned to leave, I looked directly at Richard. His mask was cracking, his eyes burning with fury barely contained. You think you've won something here, Harrison, he hissed, but this is only the beginning. I don't bow to ghosts. I met his glare evenly. No, I said softly, but soon you will bow to the living. And then I walked out, leaving him in the ashes of his own certainty. The board reconvened 2 days later, and the air in Price Tech's tower was no longer charged with confidence. I could feel it before I stepped inside, the way assistants whispered in hallways, the way security guards looked away instead of staring me down. The company smelled of fear, though the perfume of wealth still clung to its walls. I entered the boardroom to find every director already seated, their folders thick with documents, their expressions carved with unease. Richard Price sat at the head once more, but he no longer leaned back in effortless authority. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, Victoria's defiance burned hotter than ever, though cracks showed in the twitch of her lips. Patricia Williams cleared her throat. Mr. Harrison, thank you for returning. We've reviewed the material your lawyers submitted. We've also consulted independent experts. Their conclusions align with your claims. A murmur rippled through the room. Richard's hand curled into a fist, his knuckles white against the mahogany table. Patricia continued, her tone steady but firm. The board is unanimous. To avoid litigation that could bankrupt this company, we will negotiate a settlement. For the first time, Richard's mask shattered. He slammed his hand on the table. Unacceptable! This man is a parasite. We built this company. You built it on theft, I said quietly, but the weight of the room made the words strike harder than a shout. He turned to the directors, desperation bleeding through his polished exterior. If we give in to him, we admit weakness. We admit failure. One of the older directors, a man with silver-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. Richard, the courts will not be kind. The shareholders will not be kind. Do you want to see everything you've built torn apart in the press? In bankruptcy court? Silence followed, thick and suffocating. The director's eyes pinned him in place. For the first time in his career, Richard Price was cornered with no exit. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my bones. I don't need to destroy Price Tech, I said. I need acknowledgement and justice. You stole from me when I was grieving. You mocked me when I was broken. And your daughter tried to erase me in front of the world. That ends now. Victoria shot to her feet, her voice trembling with rage. You're nothing but a bitter old man. No settlement will change that. My husband doesn't even want you in his life. Enough. Patricia's voice cut like a blade. Miss Price, this meeting is not your stage. Victoria froze, silenced by the authority she couldn't charm or intimidate. Her eyes blazed at me, but her fire found no fuel. The chairman of the board, a man who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice carried the gravity of finality. Mr. Price, the board has decided. To preserve this company, you will issue a formal apology to Mr. Harrison. Here. Now. Gasps circled the room. Richard's face turned crimson, his lips pressed into a hard line. For a long moment, I thought he would refuse. But the board's stares were unrelenting. His empire teetered on the edge, and they held the power to push it over. Slowly, painfully, Richard Price rose from his chair. His eyes locked on mine, burning with hatred, but his body betrayed him. He stepped forward, and in front of his directors, his daughter, his lawyers, he bowed. It wasn't graceful. His shoulders stiff, his pride fighting every inch, but his head dipped, his back bent, and for 7 long seconds, the man who had stolen my life lowered himself before me. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Cameras clicked as board members recorded the moment, knowing history was unfolding. When he straightened, his voice shook with contained fury. I apologize, Mr. Harrison, for the acquisition, for the oversight. It wasn't enough. It would never erase what had been taken. But it was public, it was recorded, and it was power. The settlement figure followed quickly. $67 million, wired to my accounts within 30 days. A number negotiated not for charity, but for survival. Price Tech would live another day, but scarred, its secrets exposed. As the board filed out, I gathered my papers slowly, savoring the weight of the silence left behind. Victoria stormed past me, her perfume sharp, her shoulders striking mine like a blade. You think this is over, she hissed, low enough for only me to hear. But I'll make sure you regret ever stepping into our world again. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Her threats had become predictable. Noise from a collapsing tower. I stepped into the corridor, the sound of Richard's bow still echoing in my mind. For years I had been the man bent low under grief and poverty. Tonight I had watched my enemy bend instead. But revenge is not complete with one gesture. Justice is not sealed with one check. There were still ties to sever, still truths to bring to light. And above all, there was my son, caught between blood and marriage, loyalty and truth. As I left the building, I knew the settlement was not the ending. It was only the beginning of the end. The news broke within hours. Headlines screamed across every platform. Price Tech reaches secret settlement with innovator Luke Harrison. CEO Richard Price issues public apology amid patent scandal. Clips of Richard bowing circulated online, paired with my name, my patents, my survival. The same feeds that once mocked me as a failure now praised me as a man who had endured, rebuilt, and prevailed. And Victoria? Her carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. Those videos she had posted, the interviews where she painted herself the victim, they were now replayed with biting commentary. Analysts called her reckless, manipulative, destructive to the company's reputation. The public that once admired her couture gowns now sneered at her arrogance. By week's end, she had vanished from social media. Sponsors withdrew from her charity events. Talk shows canceled her appearances. For the first time, the woman who thrived on attention found herself ignored. Richard fared no better. Though the settlement kept Price Tech afloat, the board stripped him of authority. He resigned under the guise of health reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The empire he built on theft had crumbled, not from outside competition, but from within. For me, the storm brought something I hadn't expected: peace. Horizon honored every promise, involving me as an advisor, not just a signature on paper. I found myself sitting in conference rooms again, not as a broken man begging for scraps, but as someone whose voice carried weight. Yet it wasn't the money, the suits, or the headlines that mattered most. It was the letter. Daniel delivered it by hand, days after the settlement. He came to my hotel, his tie undone, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of divided loyalties. He didn't knock like a stranger. He entered quietly, like the boy who used to slip into my workshop after bedtime. "Dad," he began, his voice rough, "I don't know what to say." I let him speak. He told me how Victoria raged, how she blamed him for not controlling me, how her love had turned conditional the moment his loyalty wavered. He admitted he had stayed silent too long, out of fear, out of weakness, and then he placed the letter in my hand. It was short, written in his uneven script. "I'm sorry. I should have stood beside you that night. I should have remembered who raised me. If you'll have me, I want to start over." For all the millions I had gained, that page of apology was the truest wealth. We walked together that night, father and son, down streets that no longer felt like cages. He asked about Margaret, about the algorithms, about the years I had disappeared into silence. I didn't give him every detail. Some scars are too deep to unwrap. But I gave him enough to remind him of who I was and who he was. Revenge had always been the fire that kept me alive. But as I looked at Daniel, I realized it had given me something greater than victory. It had given me back my place in the story of my own family. Weeks later, I stood in a small ceremony hall as Horizon unveiled a new program, the Harrison Initiative, a foundation to support innovators from underprivileged backgrounds. My name, once whispered with shame, now stood carved into plaques of polished steel. Cameras flashed, hands shook, but my mind drifted to Margaret, to her voice urging me to keep going when nights were darkest. When the speeches ended, I stepped outside into the evening air. The city buzzed around me, alive and indifferent as always, but I no longer felt invisible. For years they had bowed my head with loss, poverty, humiliation. Tonight I carried myself straight, shoulders unburdened, and I remembered the sight of Richard Price lowering his head before me. Not just a bow, but an unspoken acknowledgement that the man they tried to erase had endured. Revenge is not about destruction, it is about restoration, and in restoring myself, I had undone them. I walked away, the night cool against my skin, the road ahead no longer shadowed. For the first time in years, I belong not to grief nor to vengeance, but to tomorrow.